A feared Mafia boss walks into his sister's anniversary party, promising himself one thing: no violence tonight. But when political goons storm the restaurant hunting a hidden journalist, he has to choose between his quiet life and total war. Marco Romano stepped out of the black car and paused on the curb, letting the city's night air clear his thoughts. The street was narrow, paved with old stones that had felt centuries of footsteps, but tonight they carried a different weight. Drivers eased expensive cars to the valet, couples stepped out in polished shoes and glittering heels, and the glow from the restaurant spilled onto the pavement like a promise of warmth. It was his sister's marriage anniversary, and for once he wanted to be nothing more than a brother arriving late with flowers and an apology. The restaurant was perched on a quiet corner, all glass and soft light, the kind of place that pretended the world outside did not exist. Inside, waiters floated between tables with bottles of wine and platters of carefully arranged food. A private section had been reserved at the back, decorated with pale flowers and silver candles. The scent of truffle and roasted garlic lingered in the air, mixing with the perfume of excited guests. Marco scanned the room with the practiced eyes of someone who had survived too many threats to ever fully relax, but he forced his shoulders to loosen. Tonight was supposed to be different. His sister, Bianca, had chosen this place because it felt civilized, safe, respectable. Her life had taken a cleaner path than his, and she clung to that distance. Marco respected it. He was here to honor her, to show that even a man who commanded fear in the streets could sit quietly at a table, raise a glass, and allow the evening to revolve around someone else. His tailored suit, dark and simple, hid more than his powerful build. It hid the fact that a small army waited outside in unmarked cars, watching corners, ready for threats that might never come. Guests gathered around the long table at the back. A few knew who he truly was and tried not to stare. Others only saw a well-dressed man with a sharp gaze, introduced simply as Bianca's brother. He accepted handshakes and pats on the shoulder with measured politeness, mindful of his posture, the tightness in his jaw, the angle of his hands. Every gesture needed to signal calm. His presence alone had already changed the atmosphere. He could feel it in the way laughter softened when he approached, in the way conversations briefly quieted as he passed. Near the middle of the gathering, a man sat with a slightly stiff posture, his suit neat but not extravagant, his napkin folded with almost nervous precision. He was introduced as Luca, a friend of Bianca's husband, a writer of some kind. Marco took note of the way Luca's eyes moved around the room, observing details with quiet precision, avoiding direct contact yet missing nothing. The man's hands lingered just a fraction too long near his pocket, where a phone or recorder might lie. Marco recognized the type, not a threat, but a watcher, someone who collected stories and turned them into words. The world called these people journalists. Marco understood at once that this man was not simply a family friend. He felt the faint disturbance in the atmosphere around Luca, as if the man carried a storm in his briefcase. But tonight, Marco decided not to investigate. If Bianca trusted this guest enough to invite him here, then he would allow it. Instead of suspicion, he chose indifference, at least for the moment. There was no reason to turn a celebration into an interrogation. The evening unfolded with practiced elegance. Plates arrived and disappeared. Wine rose and fell in glasses, and the low hum of conversation filled the room. Marco contributed little, offering brief, harmless comments, listening more than he spoke. He studied his sister's happiness, the affection in her husband's gestures, the way their friends leaned in with genuine warmth rather than fear. It was a life built on small, honest things, not on deals made in dark corners. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what his own life might have looked like if he had been given different choices, different roads. Yet even as he tried to settle into the role of a simple guest, his mind traced exits and blind spots. He noted the location of the kitchen door, the narrow corridor leading to the restrooms, the discreet door to the wine cellar at the back. He observed the staff, their routines, the way they moved around obstacles. The habit of mapping spaces for danger was as natural to him as breathing. It did not matter how many candles burned on the table, the shadows were always there, waiting. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, but under that rhythm lay a more dangerous beat. A senator named Ricci had grown bolder every year, weaving corrupt threads through the institutions that were supposed to protect citizens. Marco's world had collided more than once with the senator's allies, and each time it left a bitter taste. Power dressed in respectability offended him more than open brutality. At least criminals were honest about what they were. Politicians like Ricci wrapped their greed in speeches and flags. Marco did not know that this same senator had recently discovered a problem, a journalist with enough evidence to tear holes in carefully constructed illusions. That journalist had been tracking money, favors, and threats, and had followed a trail that led through several neighborhoods where Marco's name still echoed like a warning. It was not difficult for Ricci to guess where this journalist might appear. A family event, a crowded room, a seemingly safe place. Perfect cover for a quiet disappearance. Inside the restaurant, the candles flickered gently as someone prepared to bring out the anniversary cake. A soft, familiar song floated through the air, and guests turned toward Bianca and her husband with smiles and raised glasses. The moment was delicate, perfectly balanced, like a glass figurine placed at the edge of a shelf. Marco watched the flames on the cake move in slow motion, sensing a shift he could not yet name, a distant vibration in the atmosphere that tugged at instincts he had trained never to ignore. The disturbance arrived on heavy footsteps and a gust of cold air. The main doors of the restaurant opened with a force that did not match the refined setting. Heads turned instinctively. A cluster of men stepped inside, shoulders broad under dark coats, movements coordinated in that way shared by people who were used to handling trouble together. They did not belong in this polished, intimate environment. Their presence carried the smell of cheap cigarettes, street dust, and unrestrained confidence. The maitre d' approached them at once, wearing the strained smile of someone who believed every situation could be calmed with polite words and rules about reservations. The lead intruder barely slowed, brushing past him with a dismissive flick of the eyes. Behind the front line, more men lingered near the entrance, spreading out with deliberate casualness, eyes scanning tables, faces, and possible exits. The restaurant's soft background music did not stop, but the mood changed so sharply it might as well have. Guests stiffened. Conversations faltered and died. A few people reached for their phones instinctively, then hesitated as one of the newcomers lifted his hand with a gesture that was not openly threatening, but carried the promise of escalation. The hostess, suddenly at a loss, looked toward the private section as if seeking guidance from someone with authority. Her eyes found Marco's, and in that short silent exchange he understood that the evening had crossed an unseen line. The lead man wore a suit that tried to imitate power but had the wrong cut, just a little too loud, a little too tight. His tie was red, a choice that shouted rather than spoke. Under the fabric, his posture carried the relaxed violence of someone who trusted the protection behind him, someone used to acting without consequences. Senator Ricci liked this type, loyal enough to obey, ambitious enough to be cruel, not smart enough to ask too many questions. The group moved toward the back of the restaurant, toward the private area where Bianca's celebration was underway. The staff attempted to intervene with gentle objections about privacy and events, but the intruders brushed past them with mechanical persistence. One of them produced a folded piece of paper and waved it like a badge, muttering about an investigation, security concerns, and potential threats. The words were meaningless, but the tone and posture carried the weight of authority for those who wanted to believe it. To the nervous guests, they looked like officials on a mission. Marco watched them approach, his expression still, his posture unchanged. Inside, a slow, cold anger began to rise. He read the situation in seconds. The false air of legitimacy, the careless swagger, the timed entrance during a public celebration. This was not a random robbery or a drunken outburst. This was a message from people who thought a restaurant full of civilians made for convenient leverage. They relied on fear, confusion, and the assumption that no one here would dare to challenge them. The lead man announced that there had been a report of suspicious activity, that someone in the room was under investigation. He demanded that everyone place their phones on the tables, then raise their hands. The staff exchanged helpless glances. Guests looked around with wide eyes, caught between compliance and disbelief. The intruders began moving among the tables, gathering phones in quiet piles, scanning faces with narrowed eyes. The illusion of safety shattered completely. Luca, the journalist, sat frozen in his chair. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his face remained calm enough to avoid immediate attention. He knew what this was. The pattern was clear: a group of men with political backing, a sudden intervention under the thin veil of authority, the demand for devices that might contain evidence. He had seen similar tactics used to intimidate activists and erase inconvenient recordings. This time, he was the real target, and he understood that if they found him, he would not be leaving through the front door. Marco's gaze locked briefly with Luca's. In that exchange, neither man needed words. Marco saw the fear hidden behind steady eyes. The way Luca's hand hovered near his jacket pocket, where not just a phone but likely something more damning lay concealed. Notes, images, documents that could hurt powerful people. Marco did not know exactly what this man carried, but he understood that Senator Ricci's shadow was in the room now. Ricci's arrogance had stepped into his sister's celebration uninvited. The intruder's search grew more invasive. They began asking for identification, moving with increasing impatience between tables. A few guests protested softly, but fell silent when confronted with cold stares and hands resting casually near concealed weapons. The restaurant's carefully curated atmosphere crumbled. Nervous laughter died. Children were pulled closer to parents. Candles flickered in the disturbance of passing bodies. Marco remained seated, appearing to comply, but every muscle was coiling for action. He counted the men, registered their positions, the weight shifts that suggested hidden firearms, the small gestures that revealed who was leading and who was following. He noticed the slight delay in the movement of two men near the kitchen door, as if they were not fully committed to the plan or were distracted by something out of sight. Weak links, potential openings. His mind overlaid a different map on the restaurant, a tactical grid of routes, bottlenecks, and opportunities. The kitchen door became a choke point, the corridor to the restrooms a funnel, the wine cellar an isolated chamber. The staff were scattered pieces on this board, frightened but movable. His own men, stationed outside in cars, were close enough if he could signal them without escalating the situation too early. The humiliation of the moment pressed against his pride. These men stormed into a family event backed by the invisible shield of political power, trusting that fear of scandal and violence would keep everyone passive. They believed that the worst that would happen was a few shaken guests and a missing journalist. They had not considered that the man quietly sitting at the back of the room was used to dealing with threats far less polite and far more lethal. Marco understood the stakes. If he reacted recklessly, civilians might be caught in the crossfire. If he did nothing, the intruders would walk out with their target and their stolen devices, leaving behind only confusion and silence. Somewhere in that balance, a third path would have to be carved, one that protected his sister, her guests, and his own interests. The room waited on the edge of a decision that had not yet been made, while the men sponsored by Ricci continued their arrogant search. The first step was to disappear without vanishing. Marco needed to move out of the spotlight without drawing attention. When the intruders turned their backs to examine another cluster of guests, he shifted slightly, lowering his gaze as though resigned, then slid his chair back with deliberate slowness. The small scraping noise was swallowed by the restless murmurs in the room. He used the movement of a waiter passing behind him as cover, blending with the flow of bodies that still moved in hesitant patterns. He rose and drifted toward the far end of the table, as if heading for the restroom like any uneasy guest. His hands were visible, his pace unhurried, his expression faintly bothered but not defiant. One of the men glanced his way, measured him for a second, and dismissed him as just another well-dressed relative. The advantage of being feared was that no one expected you to pretend to be ordinary. The advantage of being capable was that you could look ordinary when it mattered. As he reached the corridor leading toward the restrooms and service areas, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The lighting dimmed, the noise of the dining room dampened, and the smell of rich sauces and baked bread thickened in the air. A staff-only door stood slightly ajar at the end, revealing the clatter of dishes and the hiss of pans. Marco slipped through it with the casual authority of someone who moved freely everywhere. The waiters barely noticed, their minds were fixed on the chaos unfolding outside. Inside the kitchen, controlled disorder ruled. Chefs barked orders, assistants rushed between stations, plates lined up like soldiers waiting inspection. Fear had seeped in here too, but work did not stop. The staff had begun whispering about the men in suits, about phones taken and guests searched. Marco drew aside the head waiter, a man who had served enough wealthy patrons to know trouble when he saw it. With a few firm, low gestures and intense eye contact, Marco conveyed what he needed: access to the back areas, cooperation in moving guests quietly if necessary, and silence. The head waiter hesitated for only a heartbeat. Even without words, he recognized the hierarchy of danger. The intruders out front carried a borrowed authority, this man in the kitchen carried something older and less accountable. The waiter nodded, signaling a young employee to show Marco the route to the wine cellar and the emergency exits. The boy led him through narrow passages crowded with crates and cleaning supplies to a sturdy door reinforced with metal bars. Beyond it lay the cellar, the cool heart of the restaurant. The wine cellar descended in concrete steps into a chamber lined with shelves of bottles. The air was cool and dry, the lighting low. It was a space designed for preservation, not conflict, but Marco saw potential in every corner. There were only two ways in or out: the stairway leading back to the kitchen, and a small, discreet door that opened onto an alley used for deliveries. The room was a natural trap, and in different circumstances it might have been used against him. Tonight, he intended to use it against others. He instructed the staff member through pointed gestures and steady gazes. A few bottles could be sacrificed to create hazards on the floor. Some lights could be dimmed to disorient anyone unfamiliar with the layout. The boy swallowed his anxiety and moved to carry out these changes under the guise of routine tasks. Marco returned to the kitchen, where he borrowed a server's jacket to soften his appearance even further, blending more easily with the staff. The next phase involved his own people. He stepped into a narrow alcove near the loading entrance, where the noise from the street was faint. A small vibration against his wrist signaled a concealed device linked to his men outside. With quick, silent motions, he transmitted a series of prearranged signals through a secure app: number of hostiles, approximate positions, need for a perimeter, and the importance of avoiding a visible confrontation at the main entrance. His people responded in kind, and the plan adjusted itself around the reality of the moment. Meanwhile, in the dining room, the search drew closer to the section where Luca sat. One of the intruders demanded the contents of his pockets, while another scanned his face as if comparing it with a mental description. The journalist knew he could not surrender everything he carried. His phone and concealed drive contained not only his work, but names and details that would endanger others. Fear tightened his throat, but he kept his breathing steady, telling his pulse to slow down even as it hammered insistently. From the kitchen doorway, a newly disguised Marco observed the hunters as they closed in on their prey. He noticed how two of them positioned themselves at the ends of the private table, while a third moved behind the guests, cutting off easy routes of escape. Their confidence bordered on carelessness. They trusted that no one here would challenge them and that their connection to political power made them untouchable. They were wrong, but they did not know it yet. Marco signaled lantern instructions to two waiters carrying trays. The men nodded unsurely, but the authority in his eyes left little room for refusal. Their job would be to guide specific intruders toward the kitchen under pretexts of questioning staff, accessing surveillance, or verifying identities. He also arranged for a subtle disturbance near the front of the restaurant, a minor commotion that might draw one or two of the lesser men away from their posts, thinning their presence at the back. He calculated that he could not neutralize all of them at once without drawing weapons and risking civilian lives. The strategy would have to be surgical, isolating small groups and individuals, disarming them, and securing them out of sight. The wine cellar would be his holding area. The alleys, covered by his men outside, would prevent quick escapes. The guests would be shepherded gradually toward safer corners under the guise of reorganization and safety procedures. Throughout this planning, a cold clarity settled over him. He realized that this conflict was not only about his sister's celebration or a single journalist. It was a collision between two kinds of power: the rough, direct force of the underworld and the polished, hypocritical violence of politics. The men inside believed they operated above reproach because they carried invisible shields of influence. Marco saw an opportunity to fracture that illusion. He decided that the outcome should not only end the immediate threat, but also expose the hand behind it. If the intruders left this restaurant humiliated, discovered, and stripped of anonymity, the senator who sent them would feel the backlash. The plan therefore required not just physical control, but also information, recordings, and witnesses. For once, he realized, the presence of a journalist might be more asset than risk. The board was set. The pieces had begun to move. The next steps would involve risk, timing, and a level of restraint that did not come easily to a man like Marco. He forced himself to remember the faces at the table, the way Bianca's eyes had shone under the soft candlelight. The evening did not deserve to end in blood. It deserved to end with a different kind of shock, the realization that those who hid behind institutions could be dragged into the same light they used to blind others. The first capture began with something as simple as a tray of glasses. One of the intruders near the kitchen door turned at the sound of a waiter calling for assistance, the universal language of hospitality and minor crisis. The waiter explained with anxious gestures that the manager had security footage in the back that might help identify the suspected individual they were looking for. The man hesitated only a moment before following, eager to seize anything that confirmed his purpose. He stepped through the kitchen doors into a world of steam, noise, and motion. The smells hit him first, then the heat. The waiter led him toward the rear, through the busy corridor where staff carried plates and utensils. As he moved farther from the dining room, the sounds of guests faded into a muted hum. He barely noticed the figure in the borrowed jacket standing near a stack of crates until it was too late. Marco's approach was silent, his movements precise. In one fluid sequence, he disabled the man with a calculated strike and relieved him of his weapon before the body could even fully register what had happened. The unconscious intruder was quickly dragged toward the cellar entrance by two staff members, their faces pale but determined. Marco followed, ensuring no one had witnessed the moment. The body was deposited on the cool cellar floor, wrists secured with improvised bindings made from durable wrapping materials. A strip of cloth ensured silence if the man regained consciousness too soon. The cellar swallowed him like a deep pocket of shadow. While this occurred, another small drama unfolded near the restaurant's entrance. Two of Marco's men had arrived in plain clothes, presenting themselves as concerned neighbors who had heard shouting. They did not enter, but their presence, along with a minor disturbance staged on the sidewalk, drew the attention of one of the less experienced intruders nearer the front. He stepped outside to assert control, leaving his companions slightly more stretched. Marco repeated the pattern with a second target, this time using the pretext of needing the intruder to verify staff identities in the back. The man, already irritated by the slow progress in finding their primary target, saw an opportunity to snap at someone and assert authority. He followed the indicated route with all the arrogance of someone convinced he scared everyone in the building. He walked straight into a narrow passage where the walls constricted movement. A sudden blow, a twist, and his weapon fell into Marco's waiting hand. Another body, another silent descent into the cellar. Back in the dining room, the remaining intruders noticed their missing colleagues, but misread the silence. They assumed the men had gone outside or into another section of the building to continue their search. Their focus narrowed on the private table where Luca sat. One of them demanded that the guests stand and form a line, creating a new arrangement that allowed easier inspection. Fear rippled through the group as people complied, their faces tight, their minds imagining worst outcomes. Luca's pulse quickened. He tried to conceal the object in his inner pocket, shifting slightly as he rose. His movement drew a flicker of suspicion from the nearest intruder, whose eyes sharpened. The man stepped closer, hand outstretched. Before he could demand anything more, a sudden crash echoed from the front of the restaurant, the sound of breaking glass and a raised voice, followed by a sharp shout. The intruder turned instinctively toward the disturbance. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. This distraction had been engineered. A wine bottle had been sent clattering to the floor near the bar area, its shards scattering across polished wood. A host raised his voice in feigned distress, calling for towels and assistance. Some guests flinched, others turned to look, and the intruder's line of sight fractured for critical seconds. Marco seized that moment from the doorway of the kitchen. He made a small, sharp gesture toward Luca, signaling movement toward the side corridor. The journalist understood with a jolt of disbelief, pushing back his chair just enough to begin a slow slide backward. Another guest, sensing what was happening without fully understanding, shifted slightly to block the view. The intruder's attention was split between the noise at the front and the need to maintain control at the back. He made the mistake of stepping away from the corridor's mouth. Luca moved toward the side passage with deliberate slowness at first, then with increasing speed as he left the immediate field of vision. His path intersected with a waiter who guided him toward the kitchen, where the staff's controlled panic provided cover. Within moments, he was behind the swing doors, engulfed in the chaotic yet organized energy of people who moved constantly for a living. Marco intercepted him there. In a few sharp gestures, he indicated the route to the back exit and the alley supervised by his men. Luca checked his instinct to argue or ask questions, recognizing that any delay would only increase risk. The journalist slipped through the indicated door, leaving behind the warmth of the restaurant for the cool, shadowed air of the alley, where watchers waited with eyes that missed nothing. With the primary target now removed from immediate danger, Marco shifted his focus back to the remaining intruders inside. Their confidence had begun to erode. They realized that guests were moving in ways they had not authorized, that two of their number were not answering calls or returning to visible positions. One of them barked orders, telling everyone to stop moving, but the command lacked the crisp authority it had carried earlier. Doubt had crept in. Marco chose this moment to step back into the dining area fully. Still wearing the server's jacket, he moved with purpose toward the cluster of men at the rear. His posture was no longer that of a simple staff member, it carried a quiet, contained force that drew the eye even without explicit challenge. One of the intruders frowned, sensing the shift but not yet understanding its source. The next actions unfolded quickly. A tray collided with an intruder's arm at the precise moment he turned, sending glasses crashing to the floor and forcing him to protect his face rather than his weapon. A guest stumbled forward in apparent panic, tangling the man's legs. As he struggled to regain balance, Marco closed the distance, his hands snapping out to redirect the weapon and wrench it free. A second man reached for his own firearm, but a waiter, trembling yet courageous, hurled a heavy ceramic dish toward his hand, forcing a flinch and a delay. Marco did not fire. Instead, he used the confiscated weapons as leverage, directing the barrels downward and away from the guests. His movements were calculated to control without triggering gunshots. His men outside, alerted by signals and sounds, began to filter in from the alley and secondary entrances, presenting themselves not as an invading force, but as additional staff and concerned patrons. Their presence helped encircle the remaining intruders, who suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Without a single shot discharged, the balance of control flipped. The intruders' shoulders sank slightly as they realized they no longer dominated the room. Their eyes darted toward exits now blocked by unfamiliar but resolute faces. One of them attempted a final bluff, gesturing toward the imagined authority that had brought them here, but the energy had drained from the threat. The room was no longer a collection of frightened individuals, it had become a mass of witnesses. Phones, previously surrendered, began to reappear. Guests retrieved spare devices or borrowed from those who had hidden theirs more successfully. Cameras lifted, recording shaking images of men in suits suddenly looking far less powerful. The illusion of a controlled operation collapsed under the weight of attention. Every expression, every twitch, every small surrender was captured from multiple angles, feeding a storm of images that would soon travel far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The intruders were disarmed, restrained with improvised bindings, and seated against a wall under the stern watch of both staff and Marco's people. No one moved to rescue them. Their connection to political power, once a shield, now felt like a stain. The room hummed with adrenaline and disbelief. A celebration had been hijacked and then reclaimed, not by official forces, but by the very man whose presence most people had feared in the abstract. The aftermath began in an uneasy silence broken only by overlapping breaths, the clinking of disturbed glassware, and the distant sounds of the city continuing obliviously outside. The candles on the anniversary table had burned low, their flames shortened but still alive. Bianca stood near her husband, her face drained of color yet composed, eyes fixed on her brother as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. She had known what he was capable of in abstract terms, now she had watched it occur in a room full of people she loved. Marco moved through the space with deliberate calm, checking on elderly guests, reassuring staff with firm nods, and ensuring the bound intruders remained controlled but unharmed. His men coordinated with quiet efficiency, positioning themselves near entrances without creating the impression of a siege. They were there to prevent any last desperate move, not to frighten the people who had already endured enough for one night. Luca, now in the alley outside, steadied himself against a wall painted with old graffiti and new shadows. His heart still raced, but his mind snapped into professional focus. He had clutched the drive-in phone during his escape, preserving the information that had almost cost him more than his work. The alley was monitored by two of Marco's men, who kept watch with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. One of them extended a small device, indicating that Luca should back up his data to an additional secure source. The gesture was practical, almost businesslike, and it carried an unspoken agreement: information of this magnitude needed multiple anchors. Inside, the restaurant management debated contacting the authorities. The notion hung in the air like a fragile ornament. The intruders had claimed some link to official power, and the threat of retaliation remained unspoken but heavy. Yet the presence of recordings changed the equation. The fear that usually kept people quiet began to shift into something harder: indignation. Guests shared the footage they had captured, exchanging clips and angles, piecing together a narrative that showed the men arriving, threatening, searching, and finally being disarmed and restrained. Marco recognized the importance of this evolving archive. He ensured that copies of the footage were sent not only to Luca but also to multiple secure destinations. He had spent a lifetime keeping secrets, now he was curating one that deserved exposure. The faces of the intruders, once anonymous tools of a powerful senator, were now digital evidence. Their arrogance had been preserved frame by frame. When the police finally arrived, summoned by a combination of concerned calls and external observation, they stepped into a room that no longer matched the scenario they might have imagined. There were no gunshots, no broken bodies, only shattered glass, shaken guests, and a row of sullen men trussed like reckless amateurs. The officers listened to overlapping accounts from staff and patrons, glancing repeatedly at Marco with a mixture of wariness and obligation. They knew his reputation. They also saw that every lens in the room was turned toward the intruders, not toward him. The detained men attempted to invoke names, hinting at orders and authority beyond the scope of the immediate scene. Yet each reference now carried risk. The more they insisted on their connections, the more they confirmed the link between themselves and the political sphere. The officers, unwilling to align themselves too openly with any side in the emerging storm, followed procedure with meticulous neutrality. They documented the scene, collected statements, and took the intruders into custody under the weight of far more witnesses than they would have preferred. Luca slipped back into the restaurant briefly, enough to confirm details and gather impressions, then departed to a place where he could work undisturbed. His article began to take shape that same night, structured around the contrast between the claimed authority of the intruders and the reality of their actions. He described the invasion of a family celebration, the attempted confiscation of devices, the targeted search for someone carrying sensitive information. He did not romanticize the man who had intervened, but he did not omit him either. He presented Marco as what he was, a criminal who, in this instance, had chosen to protect civilians against a different breed of predator. The story, when published, struck a nerve. Readers were confronted with images and testimony that showed men associated with a prominent senator abusing power in a setting that should have been untouchable. The article did not shy away from naming Ricci, citing financial ties, previous accusations, and patterns of intimidation. It referenced the events at the restaurant as a tipping point, where fear failed to keep people silent and recordings replaced rumors with evidence. Public reactions were swift and divided. Some were outraged that an elected official's orbit included such thugs, demanding investigations and resignations. Others fixated on the unsettling idea that a mafia figure had effectively done the job that institutions should have done, questioning what that said about the state of those institutions. In quiet rooms, Ricci's allies whispered about distance and damage control. In louder spaces, citizens talked about the blurred lines between criminals in suits and criminals in tailored coats. For Bianca, the event became a complicated memory. Her anniversary photos included images taken before the intrusion, showing laughter and warmth, and images captured afterward, with guests still in shock, holding solemn expressions over half-eaten desserts. She struggled with the knowledge that her brother's world had brushed violently against her own, but she could not ignore that his actions had protected her family. The gratitude and discomfort existed side by side, refusing to merge into something simple. Marco watched the unfolding consequences from the privacy of his study. Newspaper pages lay spread across his desk, alongside his own network's reports on the senator's increasingly precarious position. He had not engineered this outcome from the beginning, but once the pieces moved into place, he had guided them toward a result that served more than one purpose. The senator's illusion of invulnerability had been pierced, not by a rival politician or a courtroom speech, but by a journalist, a room full of frightened guests, and a man who maintained control where others had lost it. He felt no sudden transformation of conscience. His world remained violent, rooted in the language of debts and favors, enforced with threats when necessary. Yet the events at the restaurant had drawn a clear line in his mind. There were predators whose greed disguised itself as service, whose violence hid behind titles and offices. These, he realized, offended him more than any street rival. They corrupted not only laws but the very idea of order. In the weeks that followed, subtle shifts occurred in the city. Some politicians grew more cautious about the company they kept. Some journalists felt slightly bolder, knowing that a high-profile colleague had survived an attempt on his work and turned it into a weapon. Ordinary people replayed the restaurant footage on their phones, watching over and over as men who had entered with swagger were subdued by a collective refusal to be cowed and by a figure who moved with lethal certainty yet held fire. As for Marco's reputation, it evolved rather than changed completely. In some circles, he remained what he had always been, a dangerous man best not crossed. In others, a quiet, reluctant respect began to stir, not for his crimes, but for his choice in that specific moment. He had used his skills not to intimidate a room full of innocents, but to shield them from another form of intimidation. On a quiet evening some time later, he returned to the same restaurant, this time without a crowd, without fanfare. He sat at a table near the window, where he could watch the street. The staff greeted him with wary courtesy tinged with gratitude. He noticed that the wine cellar door had been reinforced and that new security cameras watched over the main entrance. The place had learned from its trauma. He ordered a simple meal and ate in reflective silence. The world outside moved as it always had, full of deals and betrayals, hopes and schemes. Yet in his memory, the image of those candles at his sister's celebration persisted, small flames burning steadily despite drafts, despite interruptions. The city, he realized, contained countless such fragile lights. On that anniversary night, he had chosen to keep some of them from being extinguished, and in doing so, he had burned a small hole in the fabric of a corrupt power. It was not redemption. It was not absolution. It was a single event, one evening where a mafia boss had stood between ordinary people and the twisted violence of politics. That night had changed nothing and everything at the same time. The scars remained, but so did the record of what had happened. And in a world where so many stories were erased before they were told, that record mattered.